On the morning of the 15th of April 1946, Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss, the former commandant at Auschwitz, gave evidence at the Nuremberg Trial. In this video you will hear his evidence, with nothing missed out. I shall add only the minimum commentary. Indeed, the only additional explanations you will find here are those of the people involved to give context and an explanation of an error. The words that follow are those of Höss, and the opinions expressed are his, not mine. And in other videos we can look at the validity of his evidence. Höss had been called to testify by Dr. Kurt Kauffmann, who was defending Ernst Kaltenbrunner. I think it's important to emphasize that Höss was a defense witness, not a prosecution witness. He was not on trial at Nuremberg. His trial would come later. Dr. Kauffmann began by stressing that Höss's testimony would have far-reaching significance, as he might be the only person able to clarify who had ordered the destruction of the European Jews, and how this order had been implemented, and what secrecy surrounded it. Höss confirmed that from 1940 to 1943 he was commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp. During this time he acknowledged hundreds of thousands of people were sent to their deaths there. He stated that he did not keep exact written records of the number of victims because he'd been forbidden to do so. Only one man, Adolf Eichmann, maintained figures. Eichmann, who organized and assembled the transport of Jews, told him that over 2 million Jews, men, women and children, were killed at Auschwitz. Höss outlined his background. He'd served in the First World War, joined the Nazi Party in 1922, and he had become a member of the SS in 1934. In 1924 he'd been sentenced to a long term of hard labour for participating in a so-called political murder. At the end of 1934 he was sent to Dachau concentration camp, where he first led a prisoners' block, then worked as a clerk, and finally became administrator of prisoners' property. He remained at Dachau until 1938, after which he was posted to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. There he initially served as adjutant to the commandant and later became head of the protective custody camp. He took command of Auschwitz in May 1940 and remained commandant until December 1943. At its height, he estimated Auschwitz held around 140,000 prisoners, men and women. He then described the origins of mass extermination at Auschwitz. In the summer of 1941, he was summoned to Berlin for a personal interview with Heinrich Himmler. According to Höss, Himmler told him that the Führer had ordered the final solution of the Jewish question. The SS was tasked with carrying it out. Himmler asserted that if this were not done, the Jews would later destroy the German people. Auschwitz, he said, had been chosen because of its favourable railway connections and the extensive area available, which allowed isolation measures. Himmler emphasised the highest secrecy. The operation was to be treated as a secret Reich matter. Höss was told he must not speak of it, even to his immediate superior, Gruppenführer Glücks, inspector of concentration camps and subordinate to Himmler. The conversation, Himmler said, was to remain strictly between the two of them, and Höss promised upon his life to maintain secrecy. Höss maintained that he kept that promise until the end of 1942. At that time his wife became curious after remarks made by the Gauleiter of Upper Silesia about events in the camp. She questioned him, and he admitted to her that what she'd heard was true. He stated that this was his only breach of the secrecy obligation. He spoke of it to no one else. About 4 weeks after receiving Himmler's order, Höss sent Eichmann, who came to Auschwitz to discuss the details of carrying out the extermination. Himmler had already told Höss that Eichmann would be the man with whom he was to deal and from whom he would receive further instructions. Höss then described the isolation and structure of the Auschwitz complex. The main camp lay about 3 kilometers from the town of Auschwitz, then called Auschwitz. Around 8,000 hectares in the surrounding area had been cleared of inhabitants. Only SS men and civilian employees with special passes could enter. The Birkenau section, where the extermination facilities were later built, was about 2 kilometers from the main camp. The early provisional killing installations were hidden deep in the woods, invisible from outside. The whole area was declared a prohibited zone. Even SS personnel could not enter without special authorization. In his view, only duly authorized persons could access the site, making outside observation practically impossible. He explained how the transports arrived. Throughout the period up to 1944, operations were carried out in various countries at irregular intervals, typically in waves of 4 to 6 weeks. During these periods, 2 to 3 trains arrived every day, each with around 2,000 people. The trains were shunted to a siding in the Birkenau region. The locomotives departed, and the escort guards who had accompanied the convoys were obliged to leave the area at once. The prisoners were then taken over by camp guards. 2 SS doctors examined the arrivals and selected those fit for work, who were marched either to Auschwitz or to Birkenau. Those deemed unfit for labour were directed first to provisional killing installations and later to the newly built crematoria. According to Höss, some 60 specially designated men handled the reception and disposal of those selected for work. This group included around 10 officers and NCOs, plus doctors and medical personnel. They had been repeatedly instructed, both orally and in writing, that they were bound to the strictest secrecy regarding everything that occurred in the extermination process. Höss was asked whether external observers could have realized that some transports were destined for destruction. He replied that an outsider who merely watched trains coming and going could hardly deduce that mass murder was taking place. It was not only extermination transports that arrived, there were also many trains bringing new prisoners for labour and other shipments. Likewise, trains left with prisoners being transferred to other camps or work sites. The freight car doors were kept closed, so it was impossible to see the people inside from the outside. In addition, around 100 railway wagons of supplies, rations and minerals entered or left the industrial installations of the camp each day. All this, he claimed, would have obscured the true purpose of the extermination trains. He confirmed that after arrival, those selected for death were stripped of all possessions. They had to undress completely and surrender their valuables, and then were led directly to their deaths. He stated that most victims did not know their fate. Steps were taken to deceive them. Notices on doors and walls in various languages indicated that they were going to be disinfected or take showers. Prisoners who had arrived earlier were used as auxiliary personnel repeated these explanations and directed them through the process. Höss confirmed that death by gas took between 3 and 15 minutes, depending on temperature and the number of people in the chambers. Victims, he said, lost consciousness within seconds or a few minutes. This timing he learned both from his own observations and from SS medical officers. Asked if he ever felt pity when he thought of his own wife and children, he said yes, he had doubts. Yet he explained that the decisive factor for him in carrying out the killings was the strict order and the justification given by Himmler. He testified that Himmler visited Auschwitz in 1942 and witnessed in detail a complete extermination operation from beginning to end. Eichmann too came repeatedly and was thoroughly familiar with the procedures. By contrast, Höss stated, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA, never inspected Auschwitz. He claimed he'd never once discussed his extermination duties with Kaltenbrunner and had only met him once in his life. That meeting, Höss recalled, took place the day after Kaltenbrunner's birthday in 1944, meaning that this would have been the 5th of October 1944. At this time, Höss was head of Department E1 in the main Economic and Administrative Office, WVHA in Berlin, the former Inspectorate of Concentration Camps at Oranienburg. The subject of the meeting was a report from the Mauthausen camp regarding unnamed prisoners, then called nameless internees, employed in the armaments industry. Höss brought the report to Kaltenbrunner so that he could decide what to do, but Kaltenbrunner postponed any decision and the meeting ended without conclusion. Höss clarified the location and jurisdictional status of Auschwitz. It lay in former Polish territory, which after 1939 was incorporated into the province of Upper Silesia in the Third Reich. Administration and provisioning of the camps, he said, were handled exclusively by the WVHA, an SS economic and administrative body, completely separate from the RSHA. From 1943 until the end of the war, he was one of the chiefs in the inspectorate within this office, and thus, by his own account, well informed about conditions and methods in concentration camps. He described how conditions evolved. Up to 1939, he said, feeding, accommodation and treatment of prisoners in the camps did not differ substantially from those in ordinary prisons and penitentiaries in the Reich. Prisoners were treated harshly, but systematic beating or maltreatment was allegedly not permitted. Himmler, according to Höss, had repeatedly ordered that any SS man who used violence against prisoners be punished, and some SS men had in fact been disciplined for mistreating inmates. Food and lodging standards were, he claimed, normal for the era, and overcrowding had not yet arisen. With the outbreak of war, mass arrivals of political prisoners and later resistance fighters from occupied territories, new buildings and camp extensions could no longer keep pace with the numbers. Improvisation helped in the first years, but due to wartime shortages, construction materials soon became scarce. Rations for prisoners supplied through local economic officers were cut repeatedly. Underfeeding, overwork and overcrowding gradually weakened prisoners' resistance to disease, and epidemics spread. Höss linked the appalling state of prisoners towards the end of the war to extreme exploitation for the armaments sector. He said Himmler, through WVHA chief Oswald Pohl and at commandant's conferences, constantly stressed that every available prisoner must be pushed to the limit for armaments production. The goal, he insisted, was not to kill as many as possible, but to extract the maximum labour possible. Nevertheless, by late in the war, the result was masses of sick and emaciated prisoners. Asked about widespread reports of torture and cruelty, Höss claimed that they were not part of a formal system, but were excesses by individual officers, NCOs or guards. Whenever such acts came to light, he said, the perpetrators were removed from their posts, sometimes transferred elsewhere, even if lack of proof prevented formal punishment. The intent, he maintained, was to separate such men from direct control over prisoners. Explaining the catastrophic conditions filmed by Allied troops at the war's end, he pointed to the collapse of transport and logistics. Bombed railway networks and industrial plants made regular provisioning impossible, particularly in huge camps like Auschwitz with 140,000 inmates. Commandants tried to improvise with truck convoys and other measures, but often failed. Medical supplies were almost unavailable, epidemics raged, and every usable prisoner was repeatedly sent to work. By Himmler's orders, even half-sick inmates had to work wherever possible. All available space in the camps was crammed with the sick and dying. Höss then addressed the broader camp system using a map with red dots indicating camps. At the end of the war, he said, there were 13 main concentration camps. The main other marked points represented labour camps attached to armaments industries. Each main concentration camp, for example Dachau in Bavaria or Mauthausen in Austria, served as the centre of a regional system. It had to supply the associated labour camps with prisoners, replace sick inmates, provide clothing and furnish guard personnel. From 1944 onwards, responsibility for food supplies for labour camp prisoners increasingly fell to the individual armaments firms employing them, so that prisoners could benefit from special wartime rations. He acknowledged that medical experiments on living prisoners took place in several camps. At Auschwitz, sterilization experiments were carried out by Professor Klauberg and Dr. Schumann, and Dr. Josef Mengele conducted experiments on twins. In Dachau, Luftwaffe physician Dr. Rascher conducted tests on condemned prisoners to study survival in cold conditions and in high-altitude pressure chambers. These experiments were formally treated as secret Reich matters, but as Höss conceded, in a large camp they inevitably became known to inmates who saw them. He couldn't say how much leaked out to the outside world. Turning to executions, Höss said that before the war there were only a few, for especially serious cases. He recalled an incident at Buchenwald where inmates had beaten an SS man to death, and they were hanged. During the war, however, the number of executions rose significantly. They were not based on sentences by ordinary German courts. Execution orders came from the RSHA. Originals never reached the camps. The RSHA sent them to the inspectorate, which relayed them by teletype, or in urgent cases sent teletypes directly to camps, and merely notified the inspectorate afterwards. Thus, the signatures seen in the camps were always typed teleprint names, not ink signatures. Höss testified that only a very small number of teletyped execution orders he saw bore Himmler's name, and fewer still Kaltenbrunner's. The overwhelming majority were signed Müller, meaning Gruppenführer Heinrich Müller, head of Department 4, that's to say the Gestapo, in the RSHA. Höss explained that all questions concerning concentration camps had to be negotiated with Müller, who was fully informed and usually capable of deciding matters immediately. He said he didn't discuss such business with Kaltenbrunner himself. Regarding evacuations in the final phase of the war, Höss described a shifting policy. Initially, Himmler had ordered that when the front lines approached the camps, or if the camps were threatened by air raids, that they should be surrendered to the enemy. Later, after events at Buchenwald were reported to Hitler, and as frontline conditions changed, this order was rescinded. Early in 1945, when several camps entered the operational zone of advancing armies, Himmler directed that the higher SS and police leaders responsible for security should themselves decide whether evacuation or surrender was appropriate. Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen were evacuated. Buchenwald was also slated for evacuation, but before it occurred, Himmler sent another order. As a rule, camps were no longer to be evacuated. Only prominent prisoners and those who under no circumstances must fall into Allied hands were to be removed and sent elsewhere. After Buchenwald was occupied, reports reached Hitler that liberated inmates had armed themselves and were looting in Weimar. In response, Hitler ordered Himmler that no more camps were to be allowed to fall intact into enemy hands, and that no able-bodied prisoners should be left in them. As the war neared its end, and northern and southern Germany were being cut apart, Höss received a call from Müller late one evening. Müller informed him that Himmler had ordered the immediate evacuation of Sachsenhausen. Höss protested, warning that there were virtually no other camps to absorb the prisoners, except a few already overcrowded labour camps. Most inmates would have to be housed in forests, meaning mass deaths and impossible provisioning. Müller promised to raise these objections with Himmler, but when he called back, he reported that Himmler refused to change the order and demanded that camp commandants carry out evacuations immediately. Ravensbrück was also to be evacuated, but could not be fully cleared. Höss said that he didn't know to what extent camps in southern Germany were evacuated, as the inspectorate had by then lost contact with that region. Asked about an allegation that Kaltenbrunner had ordered Dachau and 2 satellite camps to be destroyed by bombing or poison, Höss replied that he'd never heard of such an order and knew nothing of any instructions to destroy southern camps in that way. He doubted it would have been practically possible to annihilate a camp by such a method. At this point, Dr. Kauffmann ended his initial examination and his assistant, Dr. Otto Merkel, took over. His aim was to show that the camp administration, feeding, accommodation and discipline belonged to the WVHA, that's the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, that the Gestapo and RSHA did not run the concentration camps administratively, and that the Gestapo's role was limited to arrests, classification of prisoners, and execution orders transmitted via RSHA channels. This line of questioning was central to Kaltenbrunner's defence, which sought to argue that Even as the head of the RSHA, he didn't exercise direct control over camp conditions or daily operations, and therefore he shouldn't be held responsible for what might be presented as administrative crimes of the camp system. Höss confirmed that as far as the extermination of Jews at Auschwitz was concerned, he received all operational orders from Eichmann, who was part of the RSHA. Administration, provisioning, accommodation, and general treatment of camp inmates, however, were the exclusive responsibility of the WVHA, not of the Gestapo. Merkel pressed him to emphasize that the Gestapo as such did not run the camps. Höss affirmed this. The Gestapo decided who was to be arrested, assigned prisoners to camp categories, and ordered punishments and executions, but did not manage daily camp administration. Merkel asked when the WVHA had taken over control. Höss explained that the Economic and Administrative Office had existed since 1933 under various names, but the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps was only subordinated to it in 1941. From the beginning, however, concentration camps were SS institutions, not organs of the state police. Merkel then asked about Dr. Rasche. Höss said that he knew Rasche personally, had seen him in Luftwaffe medical uniform at Dachau, and had heard that he was later taken into the SS, though Höss didn't see him again and didn't know details of his SS membership. Counsel for the SS, Ludwig Babel, turned to the meaning of SS in Himmler's instructions that the SS must carry out the extermination order. Höss said that in this context, this referred specifically to the concentration camp guard units, not the Waffen-SS. According to his estimate, by the end of the war, around 35,000 SS men were allocated to camp duties, plus around 10,000 from the Army, Air Force and Navy personnel who had been detailed to work as guards at labour camps. Babel asked how this guard force was used. Höss replied that roughly 10% of the guard personnel were employed inside the camps in administrative roles and direct supervision of prisoners, including medical staff. The remaining 90% were used for external guard duties such as manning watchtowers and escorting prisoners to work sites. Questioned about ill treatment by guards, Höss said that he had personally never witnessed such behaviour, but it was possible that some guards abused prisoners. He argued that the SS leadership tried to keep guards' direct contact with prisoners as limited as possible because, over time, the quality of guard personnel had deteriorated. Many were older men between 50 and 60 or volunteers from various countries with poor German and little interest in their work. Among them, he conceded, there were elements who might ill-treat prisoners, but such behaviour was officially not tolerated. Internal control of camp life, he explained, depended heavily on prisoner functionaries, or capos, because it was impossible for SS men alone to oversee all labour details and internal arrangements. Prisoners were appointed to direct and manage other inmates. The internal administration of the camp was largely in their hands, especially at night when there were almost no SS men inside the prisoner compound, and only in special cases were they allowed to enter. As a result, prisoners were largely exposed to the power of the capos, and much ill treatment occurred that could not be fully prevented. Babel then asked about formal camp regulations and punishment for prisoners. Höss listed the sanctioned penalties: transfer to a penal company, meaning harder work and harsher accommodation, detention in the camp jail, including in dark cells, in serious cases chaining or strapping, prolonged standing near the camp gate, and corporal punishment. Strapping, he said, was banned by Himmler in 1942 or 43. Corporal punishment could not be ordered by a camp commandant on his own authority. He had to apply for it. For male prisoners, decisions were made by the inspector of concentration camps, Gruppenführer Schmidt. For female prisoners, Himmler reserved the decision exclusively for himself. Babel further noted that there were two penal camps for SS members at Dachau and Danzig-Matzkau, which some people also called concentration camps. Höss responded that these two camps were not under the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps, but under an SS and police court. He had never inspected them, and he didn't know their internal regulations. Incidentally, as far as the camp at Danzig-Matzgau is concerned, I've done a number of videos on this subject, and you can find a link in the description and at the end of this presentation. After a brief recess, Naval Judge Otto Kranzbühler, counsel for Admiral Dönitz, questioned Höss about members of the Navy assigned as guards. Höss confirmed that soldiers from the Navy did serve as guards in labour camps, not in the main concentration camps. These labour camps were barracks-type installations, often attached to armaments factories, sometimes situated directly within industrial premises. Kranzbühler suggested that soldiers assigned for guard duty at labour camps had been transferred to the SS. Höss replied that this was only partly true. Some such soldiers were indeed taken into the SS, but others were returned to their original units or exchanged with frequent rotations. Colonel John Armin for the United States then began cross-examination. On behalf of the British, he first introduced a series of documents about the number of Waffen-SS guards in concentration camps, including one statement by Höss. Höss recognized his own statement and confirmed that he was familiar with and agreed with the figures in the other documents. Armin then asked whether high-ranking Nazi officials had visited camps during Höss's service. Höss recalled that in 1935 all Gauleiters toured Dachau, guided by Himmler. In 1938, Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick visited Sachsenhausen. At Auschwitz he remembered a visit by Justice Minister Otto Thierack, and possibly another minister whose name he couldn't recall at the moment. Armin then turned to the question of execution orders. Höss had previously said that most teletyped execution orders bore Müller's name. Armin pressed him. Did these orders not in fact indicate that Müller signed as representative of the chief of the RSHA, that is to say, Kaltenbrunner? Höss agreed that the copies he saw at Oranienburg carried the notation I.V. Müller, IV, Infiltratung, acting for Kaltenbrunner. Infiltrating would be best translated as on behalf of, represented, acting for, or in representation of. In signatures, it would be the same as we once used PP, that's to say, per procuratorium, in older or former English. That is to say, I'm signing this because you're not available. So I wrote Alan, PP, your name. Therefore, Höss accepted that Müller was signing because Kaltenbrunner was not available. Armin then produced Höss's affidavit dated the 5th of April 1946 and confirmed that Höss had signed it voluntarily and it was true. Armin then read key passages asking Höss to confirm them. In this affidavit, Höss stated that since 1934 he had constantly been involved in the concentration camp system. At Dachau until 1938, then as adjutant at Sachsenhausen until the 1st of May 1940, after which he commanded Auschwitz until the 1st of December 1943. He estimated that at least 2.5 million people were executed and exterminated at Auschwitz by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 died of starvation and disease, about 3 million dead in total. This, he said, represented about 70 to 80% of all prisoners sent to Auschwitz. The remainder were selected for forced labour. Among the victims were about 20,000 Soviet prisoners of war screened from POW camps by the Gestapo and transported to Auschwitz by regular Wehrmacht personnel. The rest comprised tens of thousands of German Jews and large numbers of Jews from Holland, France, Belgium, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Greece and other countries. Höss specifically mentioned that around 400,000 Hungarian Jews were killed there in the summer of 1944. He confirmed the truth of these statements, adding that part of the Hungarian action extended back into 1943, but the bulk occurred by autumn 1944. He further affirmed the affidavit's description of jurisdiction. Before the creation of the RSHA, the Gestapo and the Reich Criminal Police Office were responsible for arrests, commitments to camps, punishments and executions. After the RSHA was created, those tasks continued under Heydrich's authority as RHA chief. Under Kaltenbrunner, orders for protective custody, commitments, punishments and individual executions were signed by Kaltenbrunner or by Müller as his deputy. Höss also confirmed the affidavit's statement that mass gassings began in the summer of 1941 and continued until the autumn of 1944. He personally supervised mass killings at Auschwitz until December 1943, and through his later post in the WVHA Inspectorate knew that they continued thereafter. All mass gassings, he said, took place under the direct order, supervision and responsibility of the RSHA, and he received all orders for these actions from that office. He reiterated that from the 1st of December 1943, he had been in charge of Department 1 in Group D of the WVHA, coordinating all matters between the RSHA and WVHA administrative concentration camps, and that Pohl and Kaltenbrunner frequently conferred about camp issues. On the final solution, the affidavit stated that this meant the complete extermination of all Jews in Europe. Höss said that in June 1941 he was ordered to create extermination facilities at Auschwitz. At the time he knew that 3 extermination camps already existed in the general government: Auschwitz, Treblinka and a camp he called Wolzek, all under security police and SD Einsatzkommandos. He visited Treblinka to study its methods. The commandant there told him that he'd killed 80,000 people in 6 months, mostly Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, using carbon monoxide gas. Höss found the method inefficient and chose a different technique at Auschwitz. Zyklon B, a cyanide-based compound in crystalline form, which was dropped into death chambers through small openings. Depending on conditions, it took 3 to 15 minutes to kill those inside. The special squads knew the victims were dead when the screaming stopped, that they would wake about half an hour before opening the doors and removing the bodies. Then special prisoner detachments removed rings and extracted gold teeth. Höss confirmed that the extracted gold was melted down and sent to the SS medical office in Berlin. At this stage, I do need to point out that there are a number of problems with this affidavit, particularly with the timing. The death camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka and Sobibor, here called Wolzek by Höss, functioned in 1942, and his visit to Treblinka happened in September of that year, when the commandant might have told him that he'd killed 80,000 people in 2 months, not therefore in 6 months. I'll come back to this in a different video. Höss also agreed with the affidavit's description of improvements at Auschwitz compared with Treblinka. Auschwitz gas chambers could hold about 2,000 people at once, whereas Treblinka's 10 chambers only held about 200 each. At Auschwitz, 2 SS doctors screened new arrivals. As the prisoners marched past, the doctors made quick selections. Those deemed fit for work were sent into the camp. The rest were sent directly to the extermination facilities. Young children were invariably killed because they couldn't work. Another improvement from his perspective was the deception. Whereas at Treblinka, victims often knew that they were going to be killed, at Auschwitz, much effort was made to convince them that they were simply undergoing disinfection. Even so, many victims realized the truth, and there were occasional panic, riots and attempts to hide children under clothing. When children were discovered, they too were sent to the gas chambers. Höss acknowledged that although the killings were supposed to be secret, the stench from the continuous mass cremations filled the area, so that people in nearby communities inevitably knew that mass killings were occurring. Finally, the affidavit mentioned Rudolf Mildner, chief of the Gestapo at Katowice from about March 1941 to September 1943. Mildner frequently sent prisoners to Auschwitz for incarceration or execution and visited the camp several times. A Gestapo court, SS Standgericht, held sessions inside Auschwitz trying persons accused of crimes such as escaping prisoners of war. Such prisoners were usually executed in the camp after sentence. Höss stated that personally he showed Mildner the extermination facilities at Auschwitz, and that Mildner was directly interested in them because Jews from his jurisdiction were being sent there to be killed. Höss declared that he understood English, that the affidavit was accurate, and that he'd freely signed it at Nuremberg on the 5th of April 1946. After Armin concluded, the Soviet and French prosecutors requested permission to ask their own questions, particularly about the mass murder of Soviet citizens, certain French documentary exhibits. The tribunal recalled its earlier rule agreed with the prosecutors that each witness would be cross-examined only by one representative of the prosecution, except for a few specified defendants, citing its duty under Article 18 of the Charter to avoid unreasonable delay, and noting that the subject had already been fully covered. The tribunal refused to allow further cross-examination. Dr. Kauffmann briefly re-examined Höss. He asked about the affidavit's statement that at least 500,000 people died of starvation and disease at Auschwitz. Höss specified that these deaths dated from the later years of the war beginning at the end of 1942 rather than from the early period. Kauffmann then returned to the affidavit's paragraph 3, which said that orders for protective custody, commitments, punishments and special executions were signed by Kaltenbrunner or Müller. Höss said that this did not contradict his oral testimony. He had seen very few orders bearing Kaltenbrunner's name, whilst almost all teletypes bore Müller's. As for paragraph 4, which stated that all mass gassings took place under the RSHA's orders and that Höss received his instructions from that office, he explained that in his mind this always referred specifically to Eichmann in connection with the RSHA, while the original overall extermination order came directly from Himmler. Kauffmann asked about the final part of paragraph 7, where the affidavit mentions the stench from burning bodies and the population's awareness exterminations were taking place. Höss explained that even before the Jewish mass killings began, there had been cremations in the open because the provisional camp crematoria couldn't cope with the number of ordinary deaths. Many bodies were buried in mass graves and later exhumed and then burnt in pits. These cremations predated the systematic extermination of the Jews. On this basis, he agreed that from the fact of smoke and smell alone, the local population could not have included that specifically Jews were being exterminated. They could merely have observed that large-scale burning of corpses was occurring. Dr. Otto Pannenbecker, counsel associated with Wilhelm Frick's defence, asked a few questions about Sachsenhausen or Oranienburg as it had been in 1937-1938 when Frick visited. Höss said that at the time there were no atrocities. The camp was considered a well-ordered model installation. Agricultural labour and workshop production, especially wood finishing, were the main activities. During official visits, the guests were shown the prisoner compound, dormitories, kitchens, infirmaries, administrative buildings and workshops. Quarters and hospital facilities were, he said, not overcrowded then. Living conditions resembled those in barracks on a military training ground with bed linen and adequate hygienic arrangements. Finally, Judge Francis Biddle questioned Höss directly on behalf of the tribunal. Asked about the maximum number of labour camps, Höss estimated around 900, although he couldn't give the total number of prisoners because some camps held around 100 people, while others could hold 10,000 or more. He reiterated that these labour camps were under the WVHA for guarding, management and clothing, while armament enterprises that used prisoner labour handled work arrangements and food supplies. By the end of the war, he said, conditions in many labour camps resembled those in the main concentration camps because it had become impossible to transfer sick inmates back to parent camps. Overcrowding and death rates in the labour camps were also very high. With that, the president dismissed the witness and Höss left the stand. That is the testimony of Rudolf Höss in full. In other videos, I shall examine elements of this testimony. I upload every day at 2000 hours my time, Central European time. I live in Poland and in Germany. And on Tuesdays and Fridays, I do longer sort of documentary type videos like this one. And on other days, I do a shorts video of up to 3 minutes in length. I also offer membership of this channel. Membership costs £5 or €6 or $6 per month. And that will give you access to currently over 800 videos. Thank you very much and bye for now.